So what I want to talk about is the work that we've been doing in the Purbex, or the back group's been doing in the Purbex for the last 8 years or so, and some of the questions that's raised, and some of the things that I think it might be telling us. Just for those of you who don't know, that's the Isle of Purbeck on the south coast of south coast of Dorset, and these are the caves that we actually do our swarming work in, or the bulk of it. There's one cave here with 3 entrances, another one over here, and that's our base camp in the middle. I've got to keep looking at this to remind myself of what comes next. The early work of swarming in the Purbeck was done by John Flanders as part of his PhD in the sort of mid-noughties. And John focused at the inland sites here around Langton, Matravers and Acton, and one coastal site here down at Winspit. Now, this is where all the data that I'm going to talk about this afternoon was captured. But what we have started to do in recent years is explore some of these other coastal sites and start to look at the inland sites a second time round. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Tillywyn, which is that one there a little bit towards the end, but the bulk of what I'm going to talk about was gathered here down at Winspit. As I say, we work on those 2 caves. The map at the top right, the sort of red hatched area, gives you an idea of the underground extent of the quarries. And we put traps up in both of them. In this one here, there's a mist net runs right across this entrance. There's a 3rd entrance behind the photographer that we leave clear. And we've got 1 net perpendicular to that rock, hopefully to turn the bats into the larger nets as they flower in the corner. And in this quarry here, that entrance there is there looking out over the sea. There's another one here that we put a net across. And then there's a 2nd net behind the photographer. So we've got 4 nets up in total. Interestingly, very broadly speaking, this site gets about 50% of the bats, averages up over the 8 years, and this site gets about 50% of the bats as well. And the 2 nets in here are split 50-50 between them. In terms of species that we catch there, we've caught 13 of the UK's 18 species. We've recorded 2 others, lesser horseshoe and Thusius. And the bats that we haven't had there are greater mouse-eared, although interesting, the first greater mouse-eared recorded in the UK was only about 3k from where we do the trapping. We haven't had liselers, and we haven't knowingly had alcathoe. As you might expect, the sort of classic swarming species, the myotis, the barbastelle and the brown long-eared make up the bulk of the catch, but we do get the odd grey long-eared down there, soprano pipistrelle noctule, and we've got a greater horseshoe roost not very far from the site, so we catch a few of those as well. But the couple that I wanted to focus on for the first bit of the talk are these 2. When I started doing the analysis of what we were catching at Winspit, it struck me that actually we were catching a rather large number of ceratines, certainly more than we were the sort of Becksteins, and getting on for the same kind of numbers as we got brown long-eared, and our pips were the same kind of capture percentages and numbers as Daubenton's, and yet neither of those are considered to be swarming species, at least in the UK, generally speaking. So I thought I'd look a little bit more at the data behind those 2 particular species, and I started off with seasonality. So for those of you not familiar with autumn swarming, we expect from previous studies for there to be a seasonality for various species. So, by the way, the colours are light green, mid-green and dark green are early, mid and late August, and light blue, middle blue and dark blue are early, mid and late September. So we'd expect from previous works natterers to have a peak in September, and very clearly there is a massive peak in September. We do get a few in August, but they really boost up towards the end of September. And Daubentons have a peak in August. So our data seems to support some of the conclusions drawn from elsewhere. Becksteins are pretty much spread across the whole of the season, as are barbastelles. Brants are probably a bit too few in numbers to make any decision. Now, one of the interesting things about our swarming work at Purbeck is it confirmed the work that we found from our woodland studies across Dorset, is that actually Brant seems to be an incredibly rare animal in Dorset. Whiskered seem to have a bit of an August peak, and brown long-eareds a September peak. But looking at the ceratine and the common pip, ceratine has got a very, very clear August peak. A ceratine down at Winspit in September is quite an uncommon animal. And whilst pips are a little bit more spread out over the season, they do seem to have a little bit of an August peak. So that made me think that maybe there was more to us catching these two species down at Winspit that we needed to look into. So the next thing I looked at was the time of night that we see these animals. So I've lumped all of the swarming species together in blue and the non-swarmers, Ceratine and Pip, together in orange. And again, as we'd expect from previous studies, a couple of hours or so after sunset, your swarming species numbers start to increase. You get this plateau for 3 or 4 hours or so in the middle, and then the numbers start to fall away quite rapidly as they head off back to where they've come from. And the Ceratine and Pip seem to show something broadly similar. It starts a little bit early. The peak is perhaps, or the rise in numbers is perhaps a couple of hours before sunset. And then we've got the peak, and then the number takes a bit of a longer time to drop away. So it's not exactly the same as the swarming species, but it's along those kinds of lines. So the next thing, or the last thing I looked at, was then the sex ratio. For swarming bats, we'd expect a sex ratio of about sort of 20, 30%, 1 in 2, 1 in 3, 1 in 4 males for every female. And for most of these, brants, whiskered natterers were in that kind of ballpark. But again, looking at Ceratine and common Pip, although we've got our Dorbentons appear to have much more males for the females, and our Barbastels are approaching sort of 2 to 1. Ceratine have something similar to Dorbentons, and Pips have something very similar to brown long-eared. So not only do these two species appear to have a seasonality and a time of night occurrence that's very similar to our classic swarming species, their sex ratios are very similar, their breeding condition is very similar, and 3 years ago we started ringing Ceratine, and we're getting recaptures year on year. So I think there's enough for us here to suggest that we might be thinking about considering Ceratine and common Pip as a swarming species in the UK, or at least a species that uses swarming as part of its breeding strategy. So the other thing I wanted to look at, was to look at John Flanders' data and ours and see if there was anything that those two data sets could tell us. A couple of things we need to bear in mind while we're comparing that data is there is a seasonality difference between the two. The bulk of our work, we've done a little bit in July and a tiny little bit in October, but the bulk of our work is August and September, whereas the bulk of John's work was September and October. So when we compare the species catches in a minute, we'd expect to see some seasonality differences between them. But there's also a trapping methodology difference. John used harp traps. We use mist nets with one exception, which I'll come back to in a couple of slides. So by definition, our capture area, vertical capture area, is much bigger and much harder to see. And also John's, by using standard-sized harp traps, there would have been opportunities for bats to go over, round, and under the harp traps. So even though we've got a seasonality difference which might help us explain some of the data, and we've got a trapping methodology difference, I still think it was worth looking at what the data sets tell us. And this is John's, as a percentage of catch, this is John's data as against ours. The green bars are ours. So we were trapping in August and September. John was in September and October, when we might expect him to catch more natterers, and indeed he did. And you might expect the reverse as far as Dorbentons are concerned, because he wasn't trapping in August at all, when we know that the peak of Dorbentons activity is in August. So I think the two outlined in green we can put down to there being seasonality differences in our capture times. These two I'm a little less sure of, because our data seems to suggest that brown long-eareds have a September peak, and John did his, so then you would have long-eareds running over into October. That's where John did most of his catching. So I'm not quite sure why we ended up with sort of 3 or 4 times as many long-eareds as he did. And this is the other way round from our data. The whiskered have an early August peak, and yet John caught more of them. So I can't really explain these two, but it's these ones outlined in red that I wanted to focus on for the next couple of slides. Ceratine, I think, because John didn't catch in August, and we already know that at least at Winspit, Ceratine is very much an August animal, the big bulk of the difference, I suspect not all of it, but the big bulk of the difference in those numbers is down to that seasonality. But our data, and again, I'm only reflecting on what we found at Winspit, show that Barbastel and common Pip are available in reasonable numbers over the whole of the year, or the whole of the season, sorry. So that got me wondering, how come John didn't catch any of those? Now, I can accept that Ceratine, there's a season element to it. I don't think there is for these two, and I can't believe that they're just that good at avoiding harp traps but not very good at avoiding mist nets. So whilst the trapping methods might have part of an explanation in these two differences, I don't think it's all of them. So I wanted to look at some of the sites that we trapped at. This is Winspit. These are typical of the sites that John trapped at. This is a site called Bowers. It's one of the inland quarries. And this is Port Arthur, which is about 250 metres that way from Winspit, so down on the coast. This is the site where John caught his 2 serotine, which is why I wonder whether there's a coastal element as far as serotine are concerned. But the things that characterise them is that the immediate entrance to the site is incredibly cluttered. There is a kind of horizontal entrance here. You don't know whether you can see it from up there, but one of the entrances to the quarry is there. There's another one there. So there's a kind of semi-clear horizontal flyway, and at Port Arthur there's a semi-clear vertical entrance. So the bats, when you stand there watching them coming in, they're coming straight down. So I began to wonder if there was a little bit of clutter element associated with the difference as far as Barbastell and Common Pip is concerned. So we did some trapping here. This is Tilly Wim. That was the site that was right over in the red circle on the far right-hand side on the map. And it's got 2 entrances. You can see straight away this one is very similar to Winspit. This one is a bit of a hybrid, really. The cliffs are about 2 metres to the left over the photographer, but it's kind of a hybrid between these and this kind of clutter area. But if you go through that gateway, you've got a flight of stairs take you down. When you get down to the bottom, you come out onto a platform that looks very similar to that. So at the coastal side, pointing towards the sea, Tilly Wim looks like that on both sides of it. So we've trapped at this point, at this site, 3 times using mist nets. We've caught Barbastell on all 3 occasions, we've caught Common Pip on all 3 occasions, and we've caught serotine on 1 occasion. And that was in September, when we already know that serotine is a relatively uncommon animal, so I was quite pleased that 1 in 3 times we caught them. And we've trapped at this site twice using harp trap, and we've caught Barbastell on 1 of those 2 occasions. Now, I don't think that our data is strong enough to say that Barbastell and Common Pip and perhaps serotine need these kind of sites. What I think we can say is that they appear to be caught comparatively easily and in reasonable numbers at sites like this, and it doesn't appear to be the case here. As I say, I think earlier, as far as serotine are concerned, I think there is a clear seasonal element to that. I don't think that there's or at least I don't think the trapping methodology difference is the only or the biggest difference between the data sets. But I do begin to wonder if the clutter or the openness or the coastal nature of those sites, or in the case of Bowers here, the entrance is quite small, maybe even the size of the entrance are parts of the reasons of why we've got those difference in species captures, and that's some of the work that we're going to do over the next few years, is to try and answer those questions. So just in closing, a few thank yous. Actually, that number's wrong. There's nearly 70 unique volunteers, if you like, that have come back and helped us on many, many years. 4 people definitely couldn't have done without: Pete, Chris, Colin and Stuart, and without them we wouldn't have been able to capture this data or present it all. John Strange, the owner of the site, and John Flanders for his early work, his inspiration, and a help with trying to understand how his site and his data differed from ours. And last but not least, with 70 seconds left to go, thank you for listening.